Get ready, because this is a long and deep one. So take a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, sit back and enjoy. Today we're joined by potentially the laziest farmer in the UK, and we go deep into why conventional farming in the UK has failed and is failing, and what can be done differently. Why animal impact is so crucial, and how you can build a very, very successful business by farming with nature, looking very carefully at margins, costs, input, and most importantly, creating a guaranteed market, and why we should all focus on ex-vegans as our target market. Join me and learn about the fascinating journey of farmer Matt. This is the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast, investing as if the planet mattered, where we talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities, and ecosystems, while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land and our sea, grow our food, what we eat, where and consume. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. To make it easy for fans to support our work, we launched our membership community, and so many of you have joined us as a member. Thank you. If our work created value for you, and if you have the means, and only if you have the means, consider joining us. Find out more on gumroad.com/investing-in-regen-ag. That is gumroad.com/investing-in-regen-ag. Or find the link below. Welcome to another episode. Today with Matt Chatfield, the founder of the Cornwall Project. We're going to unpack a lot on sheep, on connections to chefs, on how to build a positive impact on the land in the UK. And I'm very, very excited to have Matt on the show. So welcome, Matt.
Yep, hello. Yeah, nice to be here.
We got introduced recently through Ophelia, so a shout out to that. Obviously, anybody actually that has great guests for the show, always feel free to reach out, because it's the best way we get people on. But let's start with your story. How did you, not end up in farming, because you actually grew up in farming, but you came back to it. How did that happen? What made you go away, first of all, and then come back to it? Because I think many people, quote unquote, escape and don't come back anymore, but you decided to actually do.
Yeah, it's my whole thing is, I was born in Cornwall, and I did start something called the Cornwall Project, but we actually have we had a small holding in Cornwall, but we have a family farm in Devon. It's just across the border from Cornwall, so it's very close. And essentially, we've actually farmed the same land for at least 400 years.
Wow.
So it's only a small farm, but we were basically part of a very big estate for it. And incredibly, for 360 years, my family actually farmed on behalf of the estate. And I think we're called yeomen. So all my family are basically buried in the same graveyard. Very humble people, but on one of the graveyards, it actually says yeoman. And I think he was born, that was Josias, and he was born in, I think, 1770. So, so basically it would have been sort of very much mixed farming for a lot of that time. As I do what I'm doing now, I'm actually beginning to go through the history, and I can see what my folks basically did 400, 300, 200 years ago, which is quite incredible. But basically, we're in a very, very wet part of the world. We're in between a place called Bodmin Moor and Dartmoor. So the weather comes off the Atlantic, goes up over Bodmin Moor, and then dumps all the rain on us before heading off. So it would have been a very wet farm, and I imagine for all that time it would be very much mixed farming. So the land that we've actually got is only 80 acres, and so my family would have farmed that. And it would have been very much sort of mixed farming, sort of vegetables, sheep, cattle, sort of various things. But then my granddad was very much part of that generation of, after the Second World War, was like Feed the Nation. And
the world,
yeah, feed the world. I think
feed everybody.
Yeah, it's very much sort of UK focused. I feel I'll try to have a world view on things, but very much in this country, it was. I think they realised that during the war, we were like 20%, could only feed 20% of our own population. So, and it was the advent. They suddenly realised also they'd built lots of like weaponry, and they realised with the same chemicals they could make nitrogen fertilizer. So my granddad was basically encouraged by the government, and I was sort of doing research to realise that he was basically forced. Like, if he didn't do the things the government wanted you to do, then that potentially you could be ousted from the farming. So obviously he was all working on behalf of the big estate, but he basically ploughed all the land, planted ryegrass, drained all the land, so all the water went off the fields into wherever, would have taken out some hedgerows, But he was basically the first person who introduced the Frisian cow into like the southwest of England. So for that time, incredibly progressive farmer, incredibly hardworking man. And he basically, and it's only now I realise how hard he must have worked to try and have a herd of basically 40 Frisian cows on an 80-acre farm in our part of the world. You know, it was quite incredible. But anyway, about 40 years ago, the UK had inheritance tax came in, which basically meant all these big estates were ripped apart basically, and a lot were struggling and had to sell. So my granddad had the opportunity after 360 years of farming to buy the land. And it was a huge thing. I mean, I'm 49, but I was only 9 at the time, but it was just such a huge thing that was happening. But obviously he then bought the land. But just after he bought it, like that's when things really started happening for the dairy industry. I don't want to go to give my views on Brexit and the European Union, but there are a lot of pressures at the same time hitting farming, basically, particularly dairy farming, like the advent of supermarkets, quotas, all sorts of things happening. So growing up, my granddad just never encouraged us to farm. I loved it. I wanted to farm. My mum actually started her own dairy farm. I used to help her. But it was just never an option because I think our granddad could see the writing on the wall for small farmers. This was before farmers markets and these sorts of things. So the last thing in the world he wanted was to do was farm. So
go as far away as possible.
Yeah. So I did. And I basically went off and was always sort of grew up very much in the environment. I used to go fishing on my own all the time. I basically, if you, I was always, quite good for, a popular chap at school and stuff. But, I just always loved my own company with my dog, and I'd be down the river trying to catch salmon, actually. It just gave me a huge love for the environment. So I went off and did environmental studies at college. And then I ended up going into publishing. So not using my environmental background. And then I always sort of say I got very hedonistic, basically. In the UK, publishing, like now, nobody really drinks at lunchtime, but like 20, 30 years ago, they did. So basically, I went to London, and for 10 years, I basically worked fairly hard, but drank a lot, had a lot of fun, and, sort of forgot my farming background. But then my granddad actually got very ill. And it's one of my biggest regrets in life, actually, is he got very unwell, and I just didn't take it that seriously. And I went and saw him a couple of times, and then he died. And it was, and then it was, just a hard time. And I just realised, I felt very guilty. And then 6 years later, my nan, who you're very, very close to, she became very unwell. So I actually moved back to Devon.
You felt very bad because, of course, on the personal side, but also because you sort of lost that. Because you said, then I did research and I understand how hard he must have worked.
Yeah.
Like for that super crucial period in the history of the countryside and farming, you had a direct access, but you maybe didn't. I mean, there were probably also books in that story.
Yeah.
There was a lot there that you maybe forgot or pushed in a corner.
You sort of saw a man who was, even when he passed away, he was a very physically strong man, mentally very strong. But he'd given his body, he basically had one knee replacement. He was waiting for another knee replacement. He'd given his body for farming. And he always it was actually quite scary thinking, if he can't do it, how could anyone else ever do it? No one could work harder than him. But I sort of say one memory, and sometimes I cry when I say this, but our farm is basically 100 metres from the graveyard. And when the morning he passed away, I went up there about 5 a.m., cried my heart, when I saw his coffin, cried my eyes out. And I was like, all he ever did really was he would farm, he'd milk cows, spend a lot of time making sure the drainage ditches were clear so that all the water could come off and go in the wood. And he then used to go once a week to Hoseley Market, which is just a very small town, so every Wednesday he'd go there. And that was his life. But then when he died, I was one of the coffin bearers, so we had to walk up. I'd done my crying really, and I thought, I'm just going to be, put a brave face. And I walked up and literally there were 2,000 people waiting. It was just insane. And it was like this man, such a simple life, but was so well, almost running on now, but just so well respected. And that just hit me just to, I always laugh at myself now because I've got Instagram followers and do all sorts of things, but I'd probably have about 20 people turn up to my funeral. It's usually incredible.
Yeah, what can we learn about that? I think there's something very deep.
Yeah.
That
really
we
deep.
Don't
really
understand on stewarding the land. I think stewarding might be the right word. It might be fancy words that I don't know. But that even, of course, he was forced in a system and blocked in a system, and he did probably the max he could possibly do under the conditions,
absolutely.
and saw the writing on the wall. But there was no chance to change.
Yeah.
Or there was a chance to change, but to move with the system.
If he was younger, or if we had a bigger farm, the only way you could change, because things like dirty water systems came, it's all good stuff, that you had to basically collect all your, all the waste in the cattle. You had to store it, and this would have cost tens of thousands of pounds. So it was a time when either the small dairy farm went out of business, or very ambitious younger people started buying up farms. So it was the beginning of, and I think
intensification of. Yeah.
So if he'd been a younger man, he would have done it. Like if he'd been the next generation, he'd probably, we probably have 800 cows all feeding inside. We'd actually put it.
Or if he would be young now, he would be on YouTube learning about the latest grazing stuff.
I don't think he ever would have gone on YouTube. I do think that.
If he was 20 now, maybe. He would be learning. I think that entrepreneurial spirit is, and that
you're right. I think
he probably would have pushed the boundaries now. I'm imagining.
The bit I find really interesting is, because I've now come along, probably talk more about it, but I'm totally changing the way, I've gone from what he's done. I'm now unpacking all that and changing it. But I think his name is Gang. Well, Arthur John Knight was his name, but they're both, his dad and his name are both Gang. So I know him as like Gang. But they must have, his dad must have farmed in a way that was just with nature, like it would have been the way I'm trying to do it now. They must have had such debates about,
when he brought in the ditches and the different cow breeds, and but the bit must have been as big as now, like huge. And the discussion would have been exactly similar.
But the difference is that I'm sure they would have had arguments, but they would have ploughed the land, they would have planted the ryegrass, they would have put the chemical fertilizer, and it must have exploded. It must have seemed like a miracle. It must have just seemed like, it just would have, like. So I
finished any discussion. It probably would have look, it works.
Within 1 year, I guarantee within 1 year, it'd just been like, and all the neighbours must have been like, it's just like, so
it's a trap, because if you don't do it, then and all your neighbors do, and they double or whatever the X is in that, like the multiplier is their production, and suddenly you see new roofs on their houses and all of that, new cars and their stuff. Like the pressure to go on with that, even though maybe deep down, you see some effects that in a couple of years start to, like, you have to keep adding more and more, but it's a mousetrap. It keeps going faster and faster, like that wheel, that spinning wheel. And that's the tricky part. Like, how do we get off that? Because if you don't do it, somebody else does, and you still have the same commodity contract. You're stuck.
Yeah. But it's I think James Rebank, I don't know if he's a fantastic guy who I do follow a lot. And his book, he these
I didn't read it yet. I really have to. It keeps coming up.
For me, it's brilliant because he sort of says his dad was a bit like my granddad, where he did the transformation, but his granddad before would literally sit there and watch the farm and watch wildlife and watch the animals for like 2 or 3 hours a day. And like, because I do that, he actually said that should be classed as working. My mum's of a generation where she's like work, and like she'll sort of say, "Where are you at the moment?" I said, "I'm working in the wood." And she'll say, "Are you sitting on a chair?" And I say, "Yes, I am." It's kind, but it is
thinking is working.
I think it is. Honestly, I really do think. We'll probably talk about
I hope that we can move farming or managing the land from this extremely physical, like you mentioned with your grandfather, like that work that you need to work 10, 12 hours a day physically, constantly to partly it's never going to be non-physical. Of course, I completely understand it, but it's also much more, let's say, it's very knowledge intensive, but that farmers have more time to use all that knowledge and all the observations that are happening and to actually do something with it, which means you cannot be running around 12 hours a day, because then you don't have the time to actually observe or to process the observing. You do the observing, but you don't process. So I think that not even downtime makes it sound very bad, but like observing, thinking, hands off and seeing. Of course, we all say, "Oh, let nature do the work," etc., but it does allow you to have more thinking time.
I ought to go back to answer your question, but I'm sure we'll come back to it. But because the way I've created a market and a guaranteed market, I would say there's probably not a farm.
Mentioning that just like this, we're going to unpack that, listeners. Don't worry. Guaranteed market is an interesting thing to unpack. Don't worry.
But I probably spend more time sitting on my ass watching than any other farm in the UK because I've got a guaranteed profit from what I do. I know I'm going to make money. So
I already see a title for this interview: "The Laziest Farmer of the UK." We need to do a bit of clickbait, otherwise people don't click on interviews.
I always say that I'm probably too lazy and not clever enough to farm against nature. I need it on my side, I think. And I always say, when you've got ruminants, you're farming with nature. As soon as you remove ruminants, nature just wants to try and kick your ass. So I'm like, rather than fight nature, I'm like, let's get it on my side. So yeah, I would possibly change.
That's I love that quote. I'm too lazy to farm against nature. It's but let's start unpacking the market piece a bit.
Yeah. I mean, if I go back to so my nan died, absolutely loved her a bit. Spent about 6 months with her at the end, and it wasn't a particularly nice 6 months. But I then started really reflecting on like guilt, really, of what I felt about my granddad, and also like how could I try and I basically decided I made like 3 promises to her, one to myself, but invariably what it was that I'm gonna somehow come back and make this farm profitable. But to do that, I've done loads of I've had a lot of stupid ideas in my time, but for some reason the smartest idea I ever had was basically I can't farm, and my granddad failed because of outside forces, and if I fail, I wanted to be my folk. So I decided then I needed to get a guaranteed market for what I was going to produce. And at that time, I thought it was going to be beef cattle. So I knew I had to find a way of finding a market for that, and to do that, I approached my local butcher they're very, in a humble part of the world, but they're probably the UK's best butcher. So I approached them and said, I'll go to London.
That's a lucky break that you have one of the best butchers in the UK close to you, or did he became with you one of the best butchers?
We didn't realise at the time, everyone locally, so we come from a place called Launceston, where I was born in Cornwall, and we just grew up with Philip Warren Butcher, and he was actually, same age as my mum, or probably a bit younger. And like our population of our town is about 5,000, and the Warrens, they have a retail shop where they have 7,000 customers a week. And we just grew up with them, and in our heads, you're thinking every town must have a butcher like this. We just
so used to it.
Yeah, we didn't have a reference to know how good they were, but what they
did when you went to London, I remember.
Well, we didn't know. So I basically approached them and said, "Look, I know London. I want to farm one day, but if you want me to, I'm going to help you create a market in London." And I didn't know anything about farming.
So you didn't start the farming piece. You started finding your market in London, finding your distribution channel through the butcher.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, that's working backwards, which is fundamental.
But it was the first sort of, to be honest, I look back and it is actually, that was, I don't know if genius. It's like, it was just it just seems so obvious to me. That's what I had. Because I saw my granddad, I was just so entrenched that I'm going to have my own guaranteed market. I'm never going to let someone else dictate my price. So when I approached Philip Warren, his son Ian actually was looking to take over the family business. And I think, I don't want to speak too much for them, but hopefully they're okay with this. But Ian had just tried to go back into his family business. His dad could not have made it any bigger or better. I think Philip Warren actually said to his son Ian, like, you can come into the business, but I don't see how we can make it better. Like, we've already got every single customer, So I came
everybody can drive an hour. Like, we got they're here. It cares about good meat.
How can we? And so I came along at that time and said to Ian, it was such. It was fluky timing. I said, "Look, I'll do this London thing." Ian jumped on it, and then I just went up to London and started trying to build. Just basically phoning up chefs, and we found really crazy ways of getting, because at Cornwall, we've got our topography is such that it's wet, and we grow more grass for longer in the season than anywhere else. So if you believe that grass-fed ruminants is the best, then we should be the best, really. But obviously we're 240 miles from London, so that's the issue, is getting code stuff up to there. So it took about a year and a half.
Enough of a because you're not going to drive with a little micro van with a few kilos.
I did
at the beginning for sure, but that's not.
I did for 2 weeks. I drove up and down 3 times a week. And quite literally, on the last winter, I was driving back down again, and I literally fell asleep at the wheel. And I was like, I suddenly woke up and I thought, oh, that's bad. And I was like, right,
this could have been the end of the whole
adventure. I'm going to pull over the next service. And then before I did that, I fell asleep again. And I was like, so then I pulled over and I thought, right, we need a different, like this isn't the best. This was, and then it's
not very sustainable.
Yeah, but then we moved up to London, and then, And then what we did was we found, we actually jumped on the back of the fish system. So there's fish going up and down from, to London, like a central hub. So we basically just put everything on the fish lorry. I'd go to the middle of nowhere at 4 a.m. in the morning and then deliver. I mean, it was, but I basically delivered a van for 7 years and then was up there for 10 years. And, it started, small, but, within 10 years, I mean, what I became very good at was we didn't want to step on other people's toes. And there were always, I always sort of call the big white chefs, like all the, if you know the UK, there's quite a lot of angry white chefs of a certain era. And we realized that we came at a time when a lot of chefs who've been to Noma, young chefs, and they weren't like the cocaine, like boosted. They were very serious young people. And they'd been to
and they
Noma.
needed serious suppliers. Yeah.
What's that?
They needed serious suppliers equally.
Yeah. But about 6 of them all went to Noma, and they all came back, and they realised it was all about.
Wow, the impact of Noma. I think we're going to look back at like as a breeding ground, not just on the fermentation side because they have an amazing fermentation lab, but also just on training, like mentally training a whole generation of chefs.
Well, I do have issues with Noma because I have been there, but anyway,
never been. I have no clue, but it's interesting.
It's interesting.
How
they must be the most influential. They must have influenced more people. Yeah, so there's no doubt. So I'm not going to be negative to this. So these chefs all came back.
Influence can be good or bad. I'm not saying it's.
I think the influence on chefs was great, but anyways, it's more. Anyway, I won't. But so there were a number of chefs. So we had a chap called Isaac McHale, James Lowe. Just about 5 or 6 chefs that came back.
How did you find it? Because you were in publishing. It wasn't that you were regular. Were you regular at the restaurants, or happened to
honestly, no. I didn't
find somebody at the street and you went with your meat? Like, can you please taste my meat? Like, how does that work?
I don't know. I think because when I was in London for publishing, I didn't even go to a restaurant. I was just into drinking, to be honest. So when I went,
you got your calories somewhere else.
So it was like I just wasn't. And then when I came back to Cornwall. I honestly, I look back now and I don't know how it happened really. Like somebody inside me was like, I made this promise to Dan and I'm like, I've got to make this happen. You're almost running on, I suppose, instinct really. Like there's something inside, there's something like, there was no logic. It was like, right, I'm going to do this and that. It's hard to explain, but I'm glad it went like it did. So yeah, I remember a friend, there's a restaurant, I don't know if there's, chap called Marco P.O.I., very famous British chef, and he used to own a restaurant called Harvey's. Then that was taken over and it was actually called a restaurant called Chez Bruce. So it's so I literally phoned up the head chef, a chap called Matt Christmas. My first ever phone call to a chef was I just looked it up and said, that's the sort of place you want to supply. So literally what happened. Phoned this guy and said, look, my name's Matt Chatfield, we're going to work on behalf of Portugal Philip Warren. We're going to look to send Cornish meat to London. We're not sure how good it is. But would you like to give it a try?
That's not a very good sales pitch.
It was terrible. He literally said, mate, you sound like an absolute idiot. Like he did literally, but we'll give it a try. So he went in and then it was good, and for a year and a half, he was pretty well our only customer, but he was buying whole rib and it was that kept us going. And then what happened, these Noma chefs came back and they wanted to know where the meat was coming from. They heard that we were able to do that because the beauty of Philip Warren, what made them so special was in the UK, when it was the same thing for my granddad. It was suddenly the supermarkets came and they wanted really high protein animals that had no fat because that's how they're going to make money. So suddenly the UK, we had all these beautiful native breeds of animals like the North Devon, like the Hereford, and suddenly Limousin and Charolais came in. And Philip Warren basically went to all his farmers and said, look, if you've got the land for those animals, do it because you are going to make more money. But if your land is wet and, you are going to struggle. So what I'll do is if you haven't got the right land for these big ones, keep doing the traditional breeds and we'll pay you.
Smaller, lighter, more adapted.
Yeah, but just more like able to get fat on the type of pasture we've got. He said, if you do that, we'll pay you a premium.
To turn grass into something useful. That's the whole.
But he's, he is a true genius, Philip Warren. Just such a, he came from very humble beginnings, bought a butcher shop, but he said to those farmers, I will pay you a premium. You keep on doing what you're doing, and we'll pay you a premium. So, and I think for a long time, the trend was for lean animals in Launceston and, his butchery shop. You just had all this beautiful, we especially call it rare
no
breed.
fat.
Yeah, we had these native animals all fat, And then what was amazing,
but then there came this generation of chefs that wanted that.
Yeah,
they were looking for.
So I think for Philip
luckily,
Warren, imagine if he sort of Philip Warren, must be really interesting because he was going against everything, and obviously they also did dry aging, so that they were having animals that are fat and have got a lot of waste. They're also dry aging, which means you're losing moisture. But he stuck with his guns and he just kept on doing it because he knew it was right. And then we came along with these chefs. And basically, these chefs were like, this is exactly what we want. So it must have, it was almost like you had to wait 20 years and suddenly, so word just spread that, if you get to know
you had this meat that was impossible to find.
And what we then did was we started bringing, there's a chap called Tom Adams. To this day is my favourite restaurant, a restaurant called Pick You. It was the beginning of like the street food thing. Tom had spent a lot of time in the US, came back, started the coolest restaurant ever called Pick You. He was like 22 at the time.
Like, what is it called? Pick You?
Pitch Q. Pittcue.
Perfect. Now I'll put a link below as well.
And so he started that, and he was 22. He'd started doing like a street food thing under the South Bank in London. It just went crazy. He heard what I was doing, met me, and he literally asked me 3 questions that I couldn't answer. And I was meant to be like a middleman, but luckily, because I'm probably the worst if you're a middleman, you better keep people apart. And, you don't want your butcher talking to the chef. You want to keep all the ones. So I said to Tom, I can't answer those. I'll tell you what we do. Let's jump in the van for the weekend. We'll pop down to my butcher and you can go and meet him. And then he came down. It was the first time we brought a chef down. And as soon as they met, like 2 obsessed people, one obsessed with, like it was, you could just see like, this is
fireworks.
It was just literally like, it was to be, and actually, what was funny, I actually knew a food photographer. He actually came along the trip with us. So it's all there on camera somewhere. Like, just a little thing like, so for Chez Bruce, we were doing whole rib, taken off the bone. So Tom Adams came in. This is absolutely true story. He's watching this happen, and then we're, taking it off, and then we've got the bone, the rib cage. And Tom says, "What do you do with that?" And they said, "Well, we trim it, take that out for pasties, and then we have to chuck the bones, and the bones we actually pay to get them, sent for waste." And Tom said, "Well, why don't if you just cut it along the time, I'll take that, and then I'll, So he ended up paying 80 pence a kilo for something that was costing us money. But then he then became a very famous dish, like rib on the bone there. And they were charging about £8 a portion. Like it was just, when you saw this happen, like, right, so we're saving money, you're making money. It was just brilliant. So then it became a bit of all these ambitious chefs, because I was doing all the deliveries. I was getting up at 4 a.m. in the morning, meeting all the chefs in the morning, being a bit of a gossiper, to be honest, getting quite well known for that. But then it became a bit of a thing, like, if you want to get this meat, get to know Matt, and then he'll take you down to Cornwall, and then you can meet everyone. And it suddenly became this, like...
tour agency.
Yeah, well, yeah. Like,
organising trips.
Or a club. It just became a club, and everybody who was... And you just knew...
Was there enough meat? Like this, there, like, did this mean that suddenly your butcher was, like, having to seek other people, or was there enough supply, or what happened there?
The supply was never ever an issue. The thing is, with butchery, you just need to. Supply is not an issue. Like in Cornwall and Devon on the border, there's just so many fantastic. We've got Bobbin Moor. What you've got is a system where animals can be born on the moors and they become, born in a very healthy environment, and then we bring them down and get them fat on like very fertile River Tamar Valley. So. And because Philip Warren had got all these farmers to do what they were doing, we had just all this. But the issue was more, it's just balancing carcass. That's always been the issue. Is I think Philip Warren says, one of his phrases is like, you lose money on the bits. Like, anybody can make money on the loins and that sort of thing, but you need to be able to balance it. So that became my job then, was to find customers who would not only buy the
less desirable quote unquote pieces.
But then actually,
and those are chefs. I mean, chefs can play with that, can do amazing things with waste, what you just mentioned. Basically, something you have to pay for to get rid of. Yeah. They turn it into a dish.
Yeah, but then if you look back on Twitter, I remember, because we were looking to grow, but we just needed to be able to get rid of the offcuts. And then literally a guy just saw on Twitter saying that we're looking to start a burger company in Cornwall called Hubbox. They were going to get a sea container and make a burger thing. And they said, look, we're looking for mince in Cornwall. So I just saw it, put them in touch with Ian Warren. And now they've literally got like 20 burger places around the southwest. So as we've grown, they have. So they literally take all of the offcuts, turn it to, so that, and now that, just things like, it's just crazy, really. So,
and you could have been doing this for a long time. What made you decide? I mean, of course, you promised it to your grandmother, but to get your hands into the farming piece as well. Not just because you probably saved actually quite a lot of farms by selling these pieces into London for good prices.
Well, helped a lot, but also probably just made them like feel really good because, like, you know, at some point we started selling the Harrods, and like in Cornwall, like we were selling to a place called Ledbury, which is just, you know, would see certainly at that stage was recognised as being the best restaurant in the UK. But obviously in Cornwall, no one that was kind of the idea. But then we started supplying Harrods, and then suddenly, like, it actually just gave huge. You know, you go back there, that was what it was like. You know, the more I supply Harrods, like that, you know, the same meat that you're having, you know, in the counter, you know, like you're having like. You know, the
urban rural. Suddenly, there was a huge amount of pride.
It was a lot. You know, and suddenly it was like, oh, you know. So what was your question? I jumped on.
Why farming again? Why farming? Actually, again, why farming for you?
So I sort of
you created the market. Let's be clear. Like the market was there.
Then I'll be honest. I got did the van drive for 7 years, and it was actually very mentally and physically. Very, very taxing. The last couple of years of the van, you know, you're on your own a lot, and I felt never further away from what I actually wanted to do. So on the face of it, you know, we were getting quite popular, becoming quite social, knowing lots of chefs and sommeliers, you know, becoming a bit of a face on London. I managed to win, you know, became quite well known for what I was doing. So like the YBS Young British Foodies doing an award, like an honorary title, and then I was called, I think, Maverick at the restaurant industry. I was still driving a van. I sort of laugh. Because at one point, the Evening Standard in London do like the most influential 1,000 people in London, and I actually managed to get on it whilst I was still driving a van. So I sort of say I was probably one of London's most influential ever van drivers. But I then, as part of the thing, I started taking over kitchens and getting chefs to do pop-ups and things, and then I ended up taking over a pub in a very cool part of East London, and we just. You know, this is actually where I started doing the mutton, actually, but it just went mental. Like, so we called it the Cornwall Project. And the whole idea was, you know, by giving London very high quality produce, we're going to support the local produce economy. We took over this pub, and it just went mental, and it just became like a huge thing. And the guy who owned the pub then basically, we started working together. We actually got ourselves a very cool pub in Fitzrovia in central London. So I took it over, and I then basically became the landlord for 2 years. And I would say possibly very good at keeping people happy and entertained, but the actual running of a pub, not so great. But we actually managed to get in our first year. So it was a pub and restaurant. It was tiny. We got a big gourmand, which, you know, I'd had chef mates for 10 years who never got one. I became, you know, and we, like Fame Asher, the famous the Evening Standard review, gave us like 4 out of 5. You know, it was quite a weird.
It was a thing,
yeah. But I never felt further away from it. And after 2 years, actually, me and my business partner fell out. And then the weirdest thing, then this is where it all sort of happened, because at that time, I had to be honest, on the face of it, I was doing fantastic work, doing all, you know, being talked about by the press and all this, but I've never actually been as unhappy. And when I say unhappy, I was really, like, you know, probably suffering depression, because I just didn't feel connected to Cornwall. It all felt a bit stupid. Then I basically ended up, a mate of mine had a houseboat in Shoreditch. So I ended up basically leaving the pub, living on a houseboat for 2 years. And that's when it all started happening. And one of the funny stories I always say is, I've lived there for 2 years, and I'd walk around, and every morning, like, it was a beautiful bit of London. Like, it was all urban, but there was just so many bits of wildlife. And every day, like, there were like grey mullet would come up on the estuary, and you'd be able to see them, and there'd be coots and swans and like just all sorts. And I'd go out every morning, just naturally looking at shit, you know, like how the ducks are doing. They've had 6 chicks, and they're all right. You know, the Egyptian geese, how they doing. And in my head, I was just every morning just going around looking at everything. And then we had like a meeting of the boat people, like, and I just sort of said, you know, it just became obvious that no one else was interested in what all these animals were. And then I suddenly realised I'm basically doing what I would do in farming. I'm going out every morning, checking all the animals were all right. But at that stage, because it started getting into nature again, and then I just started, I suppose it corrects us. I could see, it suddenly became very apparent that all the work we'd done, you started hearing about plant-based food, the vegan movement, you started hearing about rewilding and the environmental aspects of cattle. And I suddenly realised that, shit, all this work we've done, perhaps it's for nothing. Perhaps we are doing bad. And then I watched a YouTube video by this Alan Savory, which I think a lot of people, you know, quite a contentious figure. And obviously his idea was actually
not in our crowd, I think.
No, I think So I watched the famous TED talk, and basically it was, we actually probably need more ruminants if we're going to save the planet. And I'm like, well, that sounds too good to be true. But, if something sounds too good to be true, then it probably is. I then just went, that's when it really started. So I basically then started watching YouTube probably for like 12 hours a day for like 2 years, and just suddenly got obsessed with regen ag. But also, I got very obsessed with like identity politics and what I could see in America. I was worried that seeing what's happening in America, identity politics, I could see it linking with the vegan movement. I could see these movements in London. I just became really. I remember like in this country, Brexit happened and Trump got in, and I had the pub at the time, and I was just totally oblivious. And suddenly I was like, I've got myself really stupid. I've been doing all this van driving, doing this. I'm dumb. I need to get smart, like quick. So basically it was a 2 year period of just so much information.
On a houseboat, watching YouTube
to
understand farming.
They probably thought I did. I was like, why? They probably thought like I was on heroin or doing something terrible. Like that guy's just always seems to be in his houseboat. We don't see it. But I was just in there literally just watching you. And if I saw an interesting farm, I'd go and see them. So I visited at the time quite a few farmers in the UK. But the biggest moment.
So you were not completely solitary in the house. You went to visit. Luckily,
I had to go and see all the chefs.
Part.
I was still working the wines. I was still looking the chefs. I was in my houseboat, and then But one bit, the amazing bit, I've always felt that ham on is the best meat in the world. The Iberico pigs from Extra Madeira, and I got an invitation, from my widow things to go and meet, some Iberico farmers, and I think I was happened upon. They're basically the best ham on suppliers in the world. And I went there and spent like a week with them. And I just realized, like, it was a real epiphany of how do you get the best meat in the world? And then I was suddenly like, actually, to get a world-class animal meat, you need animals that's walked around a long time. So the Iberico pigs, for a year and a half, they're actually foraging for a living. They're like trying to, find all sorts of stuff. It's very dry conditions. They're actually, so after a year and a half, they literally weigh 80 kilo. They're really thin. And then they put them in the acorn trees, and within 4 months, they literally double their weight. So
a lot of muscle at the beginning.
Yeah. So
not a lot of fat, and
then suddenly fat. So to get world-class meat, you need an animal that's walked around a huge amount of its life. And then at the
hasn't been inside.
Yeah. Then you need to put a fat cover on the end. And obviously, that was like because we'd done mutton freakily when I was at the pub, like 3 years before. And it was just incredible. It just suddenly hit me. This is the reason that's incredible. I suddenly realized no animal in the world, any domesticated animal has walked further than sheep do. As sheep get to a certain age, once they're ready to be killed, they've walked like, God knows. So then it was like, let's just get those animals and put fat on it. Surely, and I knew a lot by then about aging of meat and the processes. So it was just like, right, actually, I think I've got an idea to go back to Cornwall. I'm going to call Mum. So I called Mum and like, right, I want to come back. Mum had a lot of issues. My stepdad, they're actually going to be getting a divorce next week. But they were losing. They sort of taken over the farm and they were just losing loads of money, and it was just a disaster. So I came in and said, right, I've got this idea. I want to basically buy like 80 old sheep, get them fat and see what happens. And so, bless Mum, she gave me the chance really, and we did it. And it was a real hunch. And I remember going to Philip Warren at the time.
What did he say?
Philip Warren, right? Honestly, the number of Ian and Philip Warren are they're two, like father and son. Ian's learned so much from his dad, but they are just so astute businessmen, and they just know instantly whether an idea is good or not. They just know, and over the 10 years I knew them, I told so many ideas, and he just used to look at me like, mate, this is why it won't work. Blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, and the same with Philip Warren. So I went to Philip Warren and said, I've got this idea of basically fattening old sheep. And he went, literally, Matt, that's a brilliant idea. And I was just like, what? And
that's the first time you ever said that.
Yeah, it was like, and I was just like, and he said, the main reason good idea is because you've got an animal that's walked a long way, you're going to put fat on it. But he said the real clever bit is sheep produce something called lanolin, which is basically producing the gland and it waterproofs their skin. But when you eat lamb, that tacky flavour, that's actually lanolin. After about 6 or 7 years old, sheep stop producing it or produce very little, so there's no tackiness. So he said, by that age, people will be expecting it to be tough and tacky, but if you can age it, dry age it, it'll be tender, and there'll be no tackiness. So it would just be the exact opposite of what you're expecting. And as soon as I had that, I'm like, shit, okay. And then my next piece of luck was just before, this is like 3.5 years ago, I went to something called the Oxford Real Farming Conference. Again, because of my learning. It was literally 4 months before I started. And I was still then like, I've heard about his regen ag stuff, but I'm going to have to go back and I'm going to have to use fertilizer. You have to do this, you know, and I just didn't know how to do it. And so I went and met a chap called Chris Jones, who's very into the old beaver thing in the UK. There's a bit of a secret beaver club going on in the UK.
I think I listened to a book. Did he write a book?
No, there's a chap called Derek Gow, who I'm actually
probably mention him. I recognize the name.
So Derek Gow would have talked about Chris Jones a lot, you know, Chris Jones, but he's just a beautiful, incredible man. And I saw him. I went to a talk on I went to the Oxford Real Farm.
Like how to fatten them without all the inputs the old way. Yeah.
So I went to the Oxford Real Farm Conference thinking I was going to take up farm, but thinking I just don't know how to farm. And I happened upon a talk by a chap called Steve Gabriel, and he farms in upstate New York. And he was basically came from a conservation environmental background, a bit like me. And then he had sheep in upstate New York. They had a horrific drought. Everyone's sheep and cattle were struggling. And he was really struggling. He then just thought, right, I've got a wood. I'm just going to put the sheep in the woods. And then 2 months later, they came out looking like, I sort of say like rock stars. Like, and he was like, so then he's gone really deep into, so he talked about silvopasture and he talked about it very much as a drought resistance, you know? So when I then,
which is funny for you in a place where it's wetter than anywhere else.
Yeah, but it is. But then,
of course, no longer anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was just such a good time, to be honest, that, you know, all these things happen by chance. But so I saw this, and then afterwards there was a question and answers, and actually Chris Jones from Cornwall was there. I didn't know Chris, but I heard him talk. It was so lovely because this Steve Gabriel was like the most gentle spoken man you've ever met, and Chris Jones just started swearing and just so charismatic, and I'm like, I've got to meet that man. So I went down and met him, and it was honestly the most inspirational words I ever heard. It's changed my life really. He went, Matt, I'm not going to waste your time, and I certainly don't want you to waste mine. Look, do you want me to sum up everything I've learned in 50 years of farming in one sentence? And I'm like, okay.
Of course.
And he said, if you farm for nature, flavour looks after itself. And to me, because I knew a lot about nature, and I was very unique in farming where I was starting with flavour. I was so used to delivering meat to chefs and tasting it, you know, that to me was like, I can do that. Like actually, and ever since then, I met some of my best mates. You know, we grew up together, still mates after 40 odd years. And they've all actually been all comprehensive kids, you know, no fancy background, but they've all gone off and done really well in their own field. And we all met up about 3 months ago, and they all said, even though they're very successful, they're still actually, like, they've got imposter syndrome. They just don't feel like, how am I there? And when I was doing the restaurant, even though I got a biblical model of this, I felt like I was an imposter. But when Chris Jones said those words, I've never, ever, all I've ever felt is, I can do this. Like, I can, you know, like, it was just I can do this now. Like, and I've never looked back, to be honest. It was, if I hadn't heard those words, I don't know. Yeah. But then I went back to family farm. We had a small holding in Cornwall. I was able to do a bit of sheep there, you know, but my stepdad was being really, really, you know, pretty nasty actually. He was really trying to make me not do this. So when I went to the actual family farm, my stepdad was farming all the land absolutely horrifically, terribly. But we had this, so we had this, I don't know, you haven't even asked me questions, I'll just go for it. But basically, I'd seen this talk by Steve and by Steve Gabriel. And when we grew up, so obviously all my granddad, he basically ploughed the land, drained it, but that water had to go somewhere. So basically it went into our ancient woodland. And so...
And then you remembered the talk at the conference.
Yeah, so, like, hey. When we were growing up, so it basically, all the water went in there for 40 years. So when we grew up, we literally weren't allowed in there because cattle would go in there and actually get chest deep in mud. And, you know, like, it was so my nan, who was a very strong character, like, you were never allowed to go in there. Anyway, when I came back to the farm, I was really upset because I just seeing my stepdad do this horrific stuff. I then thought, I'm just going to go to walk in the wood. And also I went in there with my nan in my ear. You know, she'd been passed away like 10 years. But like, you know.
You basically went in there with like floating things around your waist just to be ready.
I literally was just like, any moment I'm going to die. And then I was suddenly walking around, I'm like, this is ancient coppice. Like, this is like, I just thought, this is like, you know, we used to farm this. Like, this used to be managed. Obviously, you know, that had been a few hundred years ago. You could just tell. So I went to Mum and said, look, Mum, I know I'm not allowed to farm the fields, but can I go in the wood?
Farm the forest.
Yeah, and Mum was like, do whatever you want. And that was that was my chance. It just gave me that in, and it was all these things that happened, and then I just basically for the first winter, and it was bloody tough. It's like mud, and I've never even used a chainsaw. I've started chopping down trees, and but it was absolutely making it. That it's all those weird things, and now I what I'm probably most well known for now. And to be honest, I've been quite. I've only been doing it 3 years, but I'll be quite cocky. But I've just literally been interviewed this week for UK Sheep Farm of the Year. So it's just after 3 years, it's pretty quite crazy. But I think what I'm really well known for, is putting mutton back on the map and making London restaurants, high end. But I suppose what I'm really well known for, if I am really, is basically going to woodland and composting it and basically showing what can happen if you add ruminants to a woodland, an ancient woodland. And it's just been a making move, really. Yeah.
What's the change if you would, like that first time you walked into the woodland, and just try to make it visually, obviously, because we're in an audio podcast.
Yeah.
And if you would go into that same, if you're still farming that,
what's really interesting,
how different is it? How does it feel, smell, sound?
What's really interesting is my uncle and auntie own like a half-acre bit, so we've left that. That's totally like it was. And next to it, we have a bit which I've done. So when you go in there now, right, even now, it's basically all. The canopy is totally full. It's totally full. So no light at all is getting into that canopy floor. You can't hear any birds.
In the piece that you left.
Yeah, in the piece you left.
Yeah. This is the control. This is the control side.
Control area. Leaves are still there from last year. So even though the leaves fell, so after 9 months, the leaves are still there. So basically to me, and there's literally, I work quite closely with guys from the Eden Project. I don't know if you know about the Eden Project in Cornwall. There's a guy there obsessed with plants. He comes and actually measures everything I'm doing.
So just summarizing, there's almost like no life.
There's no life. So basically it's dead, and there's literally 6 plants coming up the floor. There's wood sorrel, there's ivy, and there's a few other things, but that's it. So basically you go in there, I think to the UK, you would think that's like your perfect, beautiful woodland, but it's just dead. There's nothing, it's dead. So now, where I've now gone into my bit, all I've done is coppiced a few trees, and the hazel, the willow, silverbatch, it all comes back, coppiced it. I've then put in sheep where I think it's right. If you go in there in May, and it's all on video, it's all on my YouTube, but also the BBC actually came and filmed it the first time I ever put sheep in 3 years ago. If you go in there now, especially in May, there's literally 160 plants from the seedbed have come up. It's now probably one of the most productive bits of land probably in the UK. And you've got trees coming up, coppiced, they eat those, they eat the grass, and it grows the fields where I'm in Devon is just so, for farming, I think if you get depression or you get mental health issues, it's because nothing's growing. So in the winter, towards that last March and April, nothing's growing, and but the woodland starts growing in mid-Feb. Spring happens 6 weeks earlier, and you just and it just comes alive. And all it is, and this is all from the seed bank, so seeds can probably last in the seed bank.
Nothing planted. It's just been there for 40 years.
You go into one bit, it's dead. You go into the next bit, and it's you cannot. And all I've done is coppice, put it in light, and then put in sheep when I think's right, pull them out, and it's just night and day. And it's just, it's just. So I have chefs down all the time, and within I always say within 5 minutes of visiting my farm, you'll realise everything they say about sheep and ruminants is just nonsense. They are.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what is that, when you almost went down the, let's say, the vegan route, but you didn't. What did it teach you over the last years on that, the impact of ruminants or the importance of ruminants? If you had to summarize that, not even short, but what would you tell these chefs when they come and say, I've heard about the impact of methane and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And we should all eat plant-based burgers. Of course, this is characterizing it, but what did they, how do they go through that transition in 5 minutes?
I'll tell you an absolutely true story. There's a lady called Hannah, she's happy to be talking about her. We started selling my sheep online, and then she started buying it, and then I saw her name pop up, and then she contacted me on Instagram and said, look, can I chat to you? I want to send you a few questions. So she sent me a few questions. She ended up sending an email that was just so long, and just reading it, I'm this lady, Hannah, she's got issues, she's obviously got mental health issues associated with food, it was so in depth. So I said, I'll tell you what, I haven't really got time to answer this. I think it's better than why don't you come down? So she basically came down to visit, And as I picked her up from the station, we're driving back to my farm. And she basically said, Matt, the truth is, like, I hate animal, agriculture. I think it's all wrong. But I've been eating sort of like 7 years. I've been vegan and I was going to die. I had to eat meat, So, and I saw yours, and ethically it looked like something at least it looked ethically like a good thing. And obviously I'm driving to my farm thinking, oh shit, like, if we get to my farm and she doesn't like it, like it was, and she got there and like it's quite emotional because she just saw the sheep and she literally started crying, and I was like, it was just, so I'm like, so what I say to people is, so when I went through my like 2 years stage, I ended up, I call it debating. So I went on Twitter, and I always followed you mentioned earlier, you followed me on Twitter, but I always say, like, Instagram's my sales and marketing division. I'm really nice and lovely, and like it's all about stuff. But I call Twitter my political wing. But for 2 years, I just talked to rewilders, and I talked to vegans, and I talked to environmentalists. And so I think what I did was try to, in my head, come up with something that answered every single one of their questions. So I think I've probably come up with the farming system that can answer all those questions. And the one thing I say is, I was in my caravan the other day looking over my pasture. It's quite late at night. A barn owl come over. It clearly was hunting over my pasture. I took a photo, and this dear old vegan chap just went, grow vegetables instead. Like, I went, okay, right, let's unpack that. And I just said, mate, you see this field there, right? I literally kill 20 sentient beings per acre per year. I fatten 20 sheep per acre per year. So I fatten about 600 sheep on about 30 acres of pasture and 10 acres of wood. So I'm upfront about that. I kill 20 sentient beings per acre. Right. But if you want me to grow veg, I'm going to have to plough that field. And when I plough that, I'm probably going to kill 10,000 sentient beings. I'm going to kill shrews. The buzzards won't be able to feed And then I said, if you want me to grow potatoes, for at least 3 or 4 years, hardly anything's going to live on that field. So not only am I killing everything when I start with, I'm ruining the ecosystem for the rest of it. But if I just keep on killing my 20 sentient beings, and I'm giving them a good retirement, then I've created an ecosystem for literally tens of thousands of sentient beings. And so when people come and visit, they you just within 5 minutes, it's like, you just get it. So now, it's now really hard arguing with these. Like, they don't really come and debate me now because I think they know they're going to be, they're not going to, they'll just come out of it and have like a bit of a personal crisis, because I think, pretty quickly, I'm just quite good at getting to the point and but.
Did you ever had like not that reaction, meaning an opposite, like somebody that came and didn't have that switch, or
no,
like
it's just honestly,
which is very interesting.
No, it's just,
like, it's very interesting
because honestly, if you show people this bit of wood we haven't touched, and then you show them where I have,
of course,
it's like, and also the sheep just seem so happy, and I know, and all the sheep I'm getting, I'm basically buying sheep that would have been killed 6 months before, so I'm giving them
so you're giving them an extra X months, plus creating that's, I mean, we had a discussion with Charles Eisenstein here actually on that piece. Like, death is part, I don't want to paraphrase, please go and listen to that episode, but like, death is part of this agriculture system, or the stewarding the land, if we like it or not. Like, you just made a very good case of you cannot escape it if you eat potatoes or if you don't. And there is a strong case to be made to actually graze it. Also from the environmental and all the emission side of things, but let's leave that to the LCA people. But what does it do, coming back to the flavor, like that woodland mix with pasture, because your hunch was, it was amazing. Your hunch of your butcher was, it's going to be amazing, but did it end up being amazing? Yeah,
it's, because obviously what happens is all the flavors in the meat already, because they've done all their walking. What I'm now trying to do is get incredible flavor on that fat. And with fat, what happens is, like, I want animals as thin as I can get, so then I can add totally new fat. And when you dry age, that fat permeates into, if you do it properly, it permeates into the meat. So it's so important. Now, my woodland, because I've Dan Ryan from the Eden Project's been there, we think my family probably grazed it with animals 400 years ago and probably stopped 300 years ago. The climate in Devon apparently changed dramatically 300 years ago. It became even wetter, so everyone pulled off. So we probably haven't managed that for 300 years. I would say every single plant in that wood is communicating underneath the soil with a mycelium network. Like this, and obviously, if you've got one plant growing in a field, the fungi's feeding, like it's doing its bit to try and get the nutrients from its surroundings. But if you've got a whole mycelium network in a whole wood that's been there for at least 300 years, the stuff that it's doing under the soil, the stuff it's extracting, like you can see it. Like I went to my wood this morning, and the vibrancy of plants. You can see the vibrancy in plants. I think we do need to start measuring, the nutrient levels and things. But you can see when a plant is firing, it's luminescent. It's just bright green, and everything on my wood all the time is bright green. Like it's just like, and you just know this crazy stuff, and so these sheep, they're eating that. And my job is to try and make them as relaxed as possible. So their fermentation machine. I do I've got issues slightly. I think say sourdough things. I think in London, in East London, people are forgetting that the whole regen thing is about, they're thinking it's about sourdough but I actually think it's about the ruminants. But all these people are they're getting such a high profile for basically doing fermentation. And I'm like, you've got sheep, that's what they do. You need to respect them more, because I'm sure they're a lot better at getting the nutrients and that. But if I can get those animals, and my job is to make them as relaxed as possible, because what sheep will do, they go and eat in the morning, they then, goes into their first stomach, comes up, and then they chew the cud, and then it goes back down, and that's the bit that's really important. I want sheep farmers do this thing called alive or dead, where they go to a field. It's don't worry, it's not cool. You'll see a sheep.
No, I'm interested.
Yeah, you'll see a sheep.
My interesting phase.
You'll see a sheep just zonked out, and you just think that's dead. You then get close, and people say, farmers are alive or dead. They'll do a video, alive or dead, and then and the closer you get to it, before it jumps up, because basically it's fermenting, it's just relaxed, it's chilled, it's just there letting its body just get all the nutrients. So what I want is my sheep looking as dead as possible during that stage, because I know then they're extracting every bit of nutrient, and that's going into their fat cover. And they never are dead. One day I'll do it live, and it might be dead. I mean, my sheep are owed, and the odd one does die. A lot less than I thought, actually. But my whole job is to get them eating incredible stuff. But also the remarkable thing is, I've got 150 plants growing in that wood. It's obvious they self-heal. I mean, everyone talks about it. It's not like I said, but I witness it every day of my life. Is sheep, because I'm getting owed sheep. There's some farms decided they're not good enough anymore for breeding. He's going to send them off the abattoir. I buy those. Some of them are quite healthy. There might be a reason why, he's offloaded them, but more often than not, it's just they're at an age where they can't really process enough grass to be able to feed them and the lamb. But I just put them in the wood, and like I said before, they just come out looking like rock stars. If they just, sheep that are healthy will go in there, eat a bit, but they'll just want to go back in the field and get fat. But the ones that are not too well just stay there. So I just basically block them in, and they just
get healthy.
The transformation,
self-medicine.
Yeah, and honestly, I've just seen it so many times now. Sheep, you think of a bucket, put them in, 2 weeks later they just come out, and then to be honest, I think their body gets into balance. So, and then they then get fat. My job is to fatten sheep, put a fat cover on them, But also the beauty of my system is, and where I suppose if you go on my Instagram, where I become quite well known as well, is I remember the first lot of sheep we got. Literally, Mum, we bought 60 sheep, and Mum said, "Right, Matt, you're new to farming. You must never name an animal, never get emotional. You've got to be tough and brutal. These are the here to get fattened." And so, okay, cool. Literally, got these first 60. The sheep came running up to us, just basically wanted to be petted. And Mummy, I'm just looking at Mum oh Jesus Christ. So basically what happens with sheep is, obviously they've got 2 teats, and if they have triplets, there's always a spare lamb, and often a farmer will bottle feed that. But then you basically humanize the animal. But then they ended up, going back into flock. So every time I buy one of those, and it's not very often, I'll buy a flock of, 2 years ago I bought a flock of Dorsets, which are quite lovely sheep, but they're not particularly big fans of people. But there's one Dorset came running up, and I've kept that one. So I've now probably got 10 sheep. Well, now what I've got is farmers who've got their own tame lambs. They send them to me. So I've probably got 4 sheep that are basically pets of my other farmers, but their kids have grown up. I've got 6 of my own, and I call them my management team. So what's incredible is you just learn things, don't you? So I'll buy sheep from Bob and Moore. They probably see a farmer twice a year. They're wild as hell. They come into my field. And
you have these 10 managers that keep them in check.
So they'll be like, so at the moment I've got 240 sheep. So you get 40 sheep, they'll arrive and they'll look at me like, they basically look at me like I'm a wolf, like a predator. The first thing I do is then get the dog in, my Morgan, who's quite funny, and that makes the sheep suddenly get together. But these sheep are still very scared of me. I then walk into the field and literally 10 sheep come running up to me for a cuddle. So I'm there just basically cuddling sheep. And literally, all the other sheep are literally just staring at me.
That's not a
They
wolf.
are just staring at you.
Yeah.
But then the next time I go in the field, they don't move a muscle. I can walk around the whole flock and not a single sheep moves. They say sheep have got the best facial recognition of any animal on earth. Like they have to, like if you're a lamb, your mums or faces all look very similar. They obviously can tell what they are. But so within a sheep, as soon as you walk in that field once, it'll remember you. So obviously when I go in the second time, it's just, so it's just quite a cool thing, though.
And I mean, it's a potential rabbit hole, but what's next? Like, what would you envision? Now you have set up this system that works really well on your farm.
Yep.
You have the guaranteed market. You spend quite a bit of time looking at your land, looking at your sheep, which is great. But what do you feel is okay? And you've learned all this stuff on the ruminant impact on land and on woods, which is incredible because we look at woods in many places and think this is sort of the optimum state of etc. And you've shown that it's absolutely not the case. Like there's a whole world beyond that.
Yeah.
And we look at very degraded land, honestly, that could be regenerated.
Yeah.
So what do you see? Because you're not close to any time of retirement. Like what do you see as next? What are your next steps?
John, I was just thinking we ought to talk about some sort of idea to invest money. There's something called the government. I'm trying to work in a way where I don't need to rely on government money, it's possible. But for me, the UK government in particular, and I think Europe's heading this direction, is basically investing in like big corporate companies, investing in offsetting carbon, and by doing that, the government's going to let go people to plant trees and sort of the idea of offsetting. For me, there's something very interesting they're looking at, which is like nature recovery schemes. And what they're looking at doing is you need to have 500 connecting acres. And I've only got 40 at the moment. My auntie's got 40. It's definitely aimed at the big landowners and trying to get farmers working together. It has to be 500 acres of connecting land. But for me, in my woodland, we've got something called the willow tit. And the willow tit is actually UK's fastest climbing breeding bird. And I've actually got loads of them. Like Devon Wildlife Trust have come down. And that was a funny story itself. They didn't believe it. Over the winter, I was feeding all the birds in the thing. And I'm a bit of an ornithologist. Willow tits look really similar to marsh tit, but there's just slight differences. I found a Devon Wildlife Trust and said, look, I think I've got willow tits. And they said, look, you probably haven't. They're going to be marsh tits. They're very similar. I went, okay. They said, what we'll do, we'll come out in spring. What we'll do, we'll play the voice, the sound, the song of the male willow tit. And then if there's any in there, it might take hours, but they'll eventually come and, trying to fight for territory. I said, okay, cool. So they came out in spring, and this is no word of a lie. A chap called Rob Purdy, very good mate of mine now. First time I met him, came down. We literally got 20 metres from the woodland, and he went, I don't need to do anything. You've got willow tits. It's like we then walked in the wood, and literally, it's all on Instagram. There's a video of two willow tits building a nest, literally 10 metres from where we walked in. So basically, what I'm looking at doing is we've got the River Carey, which runs along, and we've got a very ancient railway line that hasn't been used in like 70 years. So my idea is to try and buy or lease the land on the railway line, and then basically start trying to connect the railway line and the river and start increasing the breeding grounds of the willow tit whilst farming in a way that feeds people and helps nature. So that's my big project now. And I think that government scheme, it's not totally official yet. They're doing trials, but I think for investment, looking at that would be really interesting for people, because there's a bit of land about a mile away, and because all my money's going on sheep and it's going on, we're actually building a barn conversion. I just said to someone, if someone's interested in this land, you can buy it and I'll rent it off you just on Instagram. And about 20 people contacted. I was like, oh, right, okay. But
something is there. Yeah.
Yeah, but that land's but I think there's going to be, for me, there's going to be, it's obviously legislation is pointing towards big corporate companies offsetting, particularly like the property sector, big property developments. I'm pretty au fait on this, and I've got friends who do it, and I've been looking at it for a couple of years. But to me, it's a bit of a con for our government. It's aimed at landowners. It's going to encourage corporate companies to buy out farming land. I think personally, we need to keep people farming, and we need to try and get small landowners working together and looking at these nature recovery schemes. So basically, I think, and then we could start using the technology that's there. We can use like drone technology to measure biodiversity, water storage, and carbon, sequestration.
And so how do you envision that would it be some kind of, because of course it's very interesting to get this land, to buy this land or lease it very long term. But then there's always this pressure of speculation, like to sell it in X years, or flip it which happens a lot in real estate because of, and so how do we counter that? How do we make sure this is long term, that you are able to farm it long term, or others that are farming with nature and producing food for people? Like, how do we make sure that land doesn't become the speculation ball that we just keep kicking around and people make a lot of money on the transactions? I
would say like the more we need to look at how we are going to structure the offsetting. For me, it's pretty. I mean, obviously we're in the UK. It's the end of summer of 2022. It's been incredibly dry. We now get incredibly wet winters, and we're getting dry summers, and especially dry springs. Storing water, and I think worldwide storing water is going to be the most important.
Instead of draining everything in your land.
It is. Bless the beaver folks. I'm totally afraid of beavers, but I think the more we go into place, so if you the more organic matter you get, the more carbon you've got in the soil, the more water you hold. And so for me, it's almost like water storage is the biggest factor. And so I think getting that measured first of all, so you've definitely got, how much water you're storing on your, and if you look in the UK at the moment, the sewage companies are just putting so much sewage into the water, the rivers are low, and it's just, there's the Armageddon, really. Like, those water companies, I actually worked with South West Water for a bit. They did give me a bit of money to do some fencing, but I totally ignored it because I wanted to fence in a different way. But it's in their interest to get farmers to hold that water on land, get it clean on land before it goes in. So I think there's a huge, huge opportunity there, actually. So water storage. So I think my idea would be, and I was only just sort of thinking about it, and I'm not, is get people either long-term leasing or buying land. But if they're buying land, it would be all part of a big pool of people. And hopefully they would get money for offsetting. They would be getting money for carbon.
That would be the return, basically.
That's
the return would be.
I would be basically
partly leases, partly small leases, and some ecosystem services.
I know that I can guarantee that I can make an income from my sheep, and it's I've only just scratched the surface of what's where I can take this. But I then also think I will introduce cows into my system, and I think I'll introduce chickens. And what I really want to move towards is like multi-story growing within woodlands. I think that's where we can produce huge amounts of food. So I want to focus on those things, but meanwhile use the willow tit as a way of expanding things. Because, the more they just go where I'm doing stuff with the sheep. There's not a willow tit in my uncle's bit, but the willow tits, every time you work, and it's not a big surprise.
It's a canary in the coal mine, basically. But on the good side of things.
Yeah. So you like willow tits in the wood. It's not a big surprise. Nature, like the idea that we have deciduous, I see what happens when you just get deciduous woodland without ruminants, and the canopy comes over, and in time it just everything just dies.
That's what a lot of the rewilding people taught us. Like, it's not like you need management. Like, it's been managed for centuries, and if we like it or not, we have to take our role as the keystone species, and we've been managing ruminants, and you cannot just put a fence around and let everything out and hope that nature magically reaches some kind of equilibrium.
Because there's quite a few. I mean, these are the people who hate me most. So there's a growth of people who they're just putting woods right, they're fencing off woodlands. Things are growing, and people are treating them like some sort of messiah. But I'm like, mate, like, people are going to think you're a genius for 20 years, but you're going to die, and then 20 years after you're dead, people are going to realise what an idiot you were. I'm quite, and they're like, they'll get really upset, and I say, I'll tell you what, I'll go down and take some photos. So I pop down, an hour later, I take the photo. You can just see, like, it's so weird when you.
I've thought about like how different managed woodlands, like you could you could just show it or even listen to it. Like if you just listen to the incredible audio of the two forests or the two woodlands next to each other.
Yeah.
And I've seen there was an exhibition by, of course, forgot the name, but he recorded a lot of nature sounds and projected it on a wall. So you could see, you could not only hear it, but you could see where the jaguar came in. And you could see, because it was another line. And it was a fully dark room in Milan. And you could basically, the full wall was, of course, really high, really big room. And you could see the sounds coming in. And you could hear the difference between a forest that was even selectively cut.
Yeah.
Like you could not see the difference. Apparently on pictures, the forests both look equally healthy.
Yeah.
But you could hear the difference because it was selectively cut and there was less wildlife.
Yeah.
So I think there's something on that sound piece as well. And make it that visual again to see, like you feel the difference immediately when you walk into there, but probably it's easier to comment on Twitter than it actually is to go and say, okay, let's look at the difference between managed and not managed.
I think you're right.
But it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, I've got a feeling my mate Bordy, when I was talking about earlier on, I think he might have sent me that actually. But yeah, I think
I will send it to you. I will find it, put it in the links below. I'm sorry I forgot the name. It's a very famous artist for sure, but the nature sound part is so you have to get to big scale because otherwise you cannot participate in these schemes.
Yeah,
but I think for me, still keep it.
Yeah, but I think
out of the corporate hands
because we've been farming a long time and because we're like an established family. My granddad was so respected, but my stepdad obviously wasn't. I always say with farming, and I think a lot of people are scared about getting into farming and they think they'll be treated. But I always say with farming, and I've proven it to be honest, is if you just, obviously I do social media, but if you just keep your head down, work hard, and pay your bills on time, and you're not a twat, or you're not you're not an idiot. After about 3 years, people start taking you seriously, and it's taken me 3 years, and now finally people are actually okay. He's all right, he pays his bills, and I think people locally are beginning to, and I think what's been very dramatic for me this year is my whole farm. It has been about drought resistance ever since the inspiration of Steve Gabriel. So the way I farm is let grass grow long, strip graze it, push it down, produce a mulch, and this year, it's just so noticeable. If you drive past my land, it was literally rained 10 days ago. Everybody else had no grass at all. Their grass is just appearing. My grass has exploded, and I've got 240 sheep on a very small farm, and they're now strip grazing, and it just works. It just, So I think no farmer can know. Every farmer, you keep such an eye on each other's land, and I've only got a tiny tractor, so I can't look over hedges. But all the other farmers have got huge tractors; they can look at mine. It's just, they would have thought really strange seeing these sheep strip grazing, but now it's just so noticeable. So I think
it's undeniable.
Yeah, I think people locally are beginning to, they will start thinking, I think really he's not like his stepdad, he is like his granddad. And I think as soon as they start thinking that, I think they'll get on side. I think this year I would like to think that's happened really. But it will take a lot of work. But the beauty is, because we've got this railway track, it's now all woodland. I don't need to have the land right next to me, because if I've got the railway track, I can have a land that's a mile away, but it will still be connected, like a
connected.
So and the same with the River Kerry, so I think that's how. So I don't need to worry too much about the land right next to me. I just need to worry, So that could be another.
Is it somewhere connected to the archery, basically?
Yeah, and it'll just be if you plant the right sort of tree. I mean, between me and you, listen, but
there are a few other people listening.
Yeah, so when I actually walked down the track. And there was a land about a mile away. I actually saw a willow tit in there, so they're obviously already using it. It's just already, I wasn't going to tell anybody, because it's but I think it's
maybe it was the other one. Maybe you didn't see it correctly.
Actually, it could have been. But the other thing I think in terms of investments, which I don't know why people...
Yeah, so what would you tell investors? Let's say we're not on the Oxford Farming Conference, which would be fun, but we're on stage at... actually, there's an upcoming one. Probably it's out when... This will be out after that. But in Amsterdam, we're sitting on stage. A lot of bankers, investors, family offices, etc., that are excited, that follow you on Instagram or other people. And what would you tell them, obviously without giving investment advice, but where to look and how potentially to put money to work?
Well, I'd say firstly... I look at the economic press, actually, the financial press, and I have to say, I think the standard journalism is pretty dreadful.
That's why we're recording this podcast.
I know, it's just they just rehash press releases, and it just drives me wild. Like yesterday, I saw something about you need to invest in proteins. What I'd say is, if you don't want to invest in, if you don't think regen ag is right, then invest your money in alternative proteins, but also invest in the pharmaceutical industry, because one is going to lead to, I mean, it's just fact. Like if you eat the sludge that they're proposing you eat, then you're going to need pharmaceuticals. Like, so those two go together. If you're not going to do that.
Basically, if you invest in it, you're creating the market for your pharmaceutical investments, which is a quote unquote fair strategy.
Yes, it's brilliant. So good luck to you. But if you actually like humanity,
but don't call Matt.
Now, what no one's talking about is they're talking about the vegan, the growth in vegan food. But I think what's becoming very obvious that without government intervention, without raising taxes for meat, lockdowns have proven that very few of the population are into the alternative meats, the beyond burgers, the impossible meats, those sort of things. So at any one time, about 1 to 2% of the population are vegan. The vegan did their own research 6 years ago. They never talk about it, but they did their own research. And it shows that 84% of vegans give up after 1 year. And I did some rough sums. So at any one time, so 1% of the population, say the population of the UK is 60 million. There's probably 1 million vegans at any one time. A year later, about, 840,000 of those will be ex-vegans. So I reckon there's probably in the UK now about 10 million ex-vegans. I think those people are wonderful. They obviously care about the planet. They do care about sentient beings, but they've gone through the process where they're realizing that actually being on the vegan diet is, for some reason, they've given up, haven't they? That market is the one that they're the ones buying all my private sales because they're looking for incredibly ethical farming systems. So I would say focus on that. Nobody's really talking about it. I haven't heard anybody talk about it, but that's the fastest growing, most ethical market in the UK. And they don't have to eat meat, but I do think it's obvious to me that you need animal fats of some sort. So I would personally, where I would invest a lot of money is...
That's my perfect next question. What would you do?
Yeah.
Like you would like $1 billion, £1 billion sterling. Like what would you, how would you put that to work?
I would get Jersey cows. I would basically, arable is where we can make the most change. Where we're farming now, we could produce really incredibly healthy livestock. We could produce really healthy Jersey cows, for example. What you need to do, we need to start basically, at the moment, all our farming systems are separate. Dairy, Highland, arable. And it's not rocket science, it's what they used to do. But where I would put huge money in is mobile dairy units on arable systems. And it's happening in Germany, there's lots of systems now. But to me, if you can make the dairy part of the arable system, so, you're doing regen ag, you're grazing your cow, you've got a mobile system, and then, to me, you could then start measuring that milk, and I'm sure from a regenerative system, it would be so, so good for you. The cattle are outside, and maybe, you need to work on the...
Would you then do like your arable system in sort of a permanent pasture way? I mean, the wild farming people, and like, how do you make sure there is not just leftover from whatever they were growing? Like, how do you make sure the cows get there?
Well, my friends of mine have got an 800-acre arable farm in Hertfordshire. We're slowly beginning to work on getting sheep as part of their system. But you imagine any one time, you probably want to do arable for 3 years and you want to graze for 3 years. So you basically, if you work down that farm,
really as a separate, as a part of the rotation, not necessarily grazing the arable.
Not grazing arable. So basically, you need to have your arable lays, whatever you do to get that soil working. You need cattle to do that.
You need to cover crops. So
you cover crops, get that working, have a mobile farming system. So, you then be collecting the milk. And they're basically regenerating the land. You don't need to use fertilizer. And those animals can be incredible. If they're the right animals, I think we need to move away from Friesian and Holstein. We need to move towards Jersey cattle. They're just they're able to turn that product into something that's just incredible. I love Friesian, so I grew up with them. And I probably love them a lot more than I love sheep. But I think
they don't fit.
As an animal, we need to go back to the animals that can turn, all of that, what's growing into, and that's why we probably do need to start looking towards back to, if you're going to graze cattle on those systems, like the red ruminants, the Herefords, that sort of thing. So basically, I've got a friend who he's called Fred Price, and you really ought to interview Fred. Fred's just a genius guy, probably, I think, early 30s. went to Oxford and Cambridge. His folks had a 200-acre arable farm. He went to Oxford and Cambridge, came back and wanted to farm. His parents were horrified. But he basically became like the
They
best.
sent him there and then he comes back.
And then he came back. But he basically became the best chemical farmer. You know, he was using chemicals. His yield was going up, but he was spending more and more money. And then one year, everything just crashed, like yield crashed. And, you know, he was the first person to talk to me that I ever had talk about this. But obviously it's happening worldwide now where your soil just can't do that chemical process where it just, you know, it doesn't matter how much nitrogen you put on, it's the soil's, you know.
It's done.
So then what he then started doing was planting herbal lays. He gets Tamworth pigs. And we help him, we help his supply chain. So with me and my butcher, we set him up with a restaurant in London. They buy all his Tamworths. But now he's like 5 years in. It has to be seen to believe. His pigs are basically his input. So he's making money on his input. And he's now producing like heritage world-class grains. And, you know, he is part of that sourdough, cool East London thing. So perhaps I shouldn't slag him off too much. I did some rough
like a good slice of bread with some interesting butter, some interesting baking. Yeah. I mean, it's part of it's part of it, but it shouldn't only be that. Yeah. Like fermentation, like we learned, happens in ruminants, which is important.
But I did some sums. And this is because actually friends of the Earth in Northern Ireland got in touch with me about 3 years ago. They wanted to talk about something. So I ended up doing some sums for them. And this needs, you know, the economists out there, obviously you need to, you know, I wouldn't say the pinch of salt, but I looked at how many pigs Fred was producing from his land. And then at the moment we've got 9 million pigs in factories, which I abhor. And it's got, you know, but if 20% of arable farmers in the UK did what Fred did and used pigs as part of their rotation, then those 9 million pigs could be taken from factories and put on land. And then I think in time you're going to realise that because he's not paying for chemicals, pigs are his chemical, they're his fertiliser, he's actually making money from his input. So in time I think you're going to...
Making money from your inputs. It's That's the one, I wouldn't say one of the tricks, but like how do you switch that conversation to how do you grow as much food for people without all the inputs, or actually make money from the inputs, which is the ruminant or the pig, but that's such a mental flip that's gonna like you have to see it to believe it, and then do the numbers, and then still probably many people would say no, it's impossible. It sounds too good to be true.
Think about it, I even thought about it. It's even funnier flip is what we sort of say down here is I want to try and talk the farmer's language, you know, and the whole regen thing, like farmers down here, they just raise their eyebrows. And so what we think is, I think at the moment I'm regenerating my land. I think my granddad did these things. My stepdad did even worse. I'm now using the sheep to regenerate it. But once it's regenerated, when it's working, I'm then moving to like low input farming. So basically spending as little as you can. The less you spend, the less, you know, the less you need to make. But now I'm suddenly thinking like, you could be a high input, but low, you know, like the pigs is, you end up, because you've got pigs on it, it's actually a high input, but it's just not one that you're paying for. Like do you know what I mean? We're talking about a low input system, but actually, you know, so at the moment I've got 240 sheep. It looks like too many, but every day, they probably, because they're quite big, they're probably pooing out 6 kilos of poo a day.
Yeah. So the input, but of course the input doesn't come from outside your farm gate, which you'd input, but like I think that's we forget that in agriculture, if you run it like a business, we would never ask that question to a bike factory. I have said it on the podcast. People are not going to say, you already mentioned it. But like you would never ask the question, how can you squeeze out as many bikes? It doesn't matter your input cost. It doesn't matter your labor cost. It doesn't matter if you have to run 24/7, whatever diesel generator you have to put on. It doesn't matter. Like we only want to know your output. And somehow in farming, like the number of bikes.
Yeah.
And somehow in farming, we always ask only that question. We never ask, but actually, what did it cost to produce this, and how far did it come from, or the environmental cost, the financial cost, just the issue of having all these lorries come on your on your land to bring stuff, and then you have to get on your big tractor to ride it out. Like it is input and output, and we never talk about the input. We only ever talk about the output, which is ridiculous from an environmental and from an economic perspective.
Yeah.
And apparently you run systems, you are able, in general, the general you, that are way less input or even zero with really good and amazing output that we find difficult to believe and does really good margins.
I mean, when I started 3 years ago, I wouldn't dare have more than like 100 sheep strip grazing.
Which is interesting. That you're like this whole feeding the world thing, like there's a limit. it's like we say much land is understocked and overgrazed, but it turns out to be really true. Like there's so much more possible than.
I've now got 240 sheep, and and that's after a drought. I could actually go up by another 60. Like my land, I say, I think there's some questions you asked me before thing, and one of the things I want to change the most is either journalists.
You're really like bringing up every question I want to ask. It's amazing. Like you're doing my job. Like what would you change? Great question, Matt. Thank you. It was going to be my final one because this is also starting to approach I think the longest interview we ever did, but it's absolutely fascinating. So thank you for making it until now. If you're still listening,
that's good.
But what would you love to change?
There's two things. One is either not just the journalists in the economic press, but journalists either need to sort themselves out and actually start thinking critically rather than reading press releases, or we just need to ignore mainstream media because they're just at the moment, journalism's gone very wrong, and they're so like obsessed with where they are in the, like, and when I see in the food industry, and bless them, some are friends, and they know I say to me like this, but you still need to start getting on board. You need to think critically about everything that you're told. So on that sort of point, so if the journalists aren't going to sort this stuff out, you just need to start looking elsewhere for information. But the thing is, what's happening at the moment in farming and everywhere is everyone's talking like peer-reviewed things. Like, so you need to start.
Where's the peer-reviewed papers?
Yeah, it's all the time. Where's that peer-reviewed? I'm like, mate, like, in that bit of wood, I've got 6 plants growing. In that one, I've got 140. They said no, but I need to get statistical data. I'm like, mate, like, here's a photo. I don't
go with two people, look at each other. You are your peers. You review it and look at the difference.
So I think like we've got to stop. I think we do actually need to listen too far. We need to trust the judgment of what farmers are seeing with their own eyes. And if they take a photo, I've just taken base measurements for mine, but you need to start realizing farmers, all we actually want to do is feed people and actually earn enough money to live. Like we don't actually want to destroy the planet. Like start working with us and trusting us, because I sit there, I'm probably 4 or 5 hours a day just watching my land and walking, looking, and like no one knows that better. Like I know that, I know what's going on. So start trusting what farmers are saying. And one thing I would say is, my granddad was told to feed the nation, and he did it. And within 2 years, he turned a farm around. Farmers are capable of changing things incredibly quickly, like if they need to, and everyone's on side. Like farmers can do it, but we need to agree on how much carbon are we storing in soils, because that's the base thing at the moment. One people are saying it doesn't store much carbon, you only put it so deep, and other scientists are saying we're storing loads. We need to get that right. First of all, are ruminants actually storing carbon? How much are they storing? Can we agree that? If they're not, we'll get rid of them, we'll eat fake meat. But if that's how we want to get carbon from up there down the ground, we need to then work out how to do that and feed people. So hopefully that answers.
And how does that, because you mentioned before the water piece is almost more interesting or more...
it's going to be all about water.
Seems to be easier to measure, like water holding capacity. You see all these great videos on YouTube and Instagram of very dry land, recently grazed land, like a cup of water upside down, see how fast it goes in. I mean, you don't need a peer-reviewed paper for that. Anybody can see what's your infiltration rate is very easy to do. Like, do you see that as an easier in than all this fluffy carbon talk that we're doing?
I think it's there is no drone technology where they can measure, they can set things up, and I think these things are actually all incredibly measurable now.
They are. You can see infiltration rates. You can see vegetation. You can see quite a lot.
But my granddad. Like, I literally had a talk last week. There's a guy who's quite hopeful. Like George Monbiot, I had a bit of a blow up with last week. And there's another chap called Guy Schwab who, they may be lovely people, but I'm not a big fan. So anyway, they started talking to me, and all these people just piled in and started having a go at me. And they're like, mate, how do you know you're holding more water? And I'm like, well, I walk every bit of land every day. Like, I know, but I said also, my granddad put these drainage pipes in. When I started in the winter, they would all the water would rain and it would all come out. I could see it. But now after 3 years, like every year, less and less and less and less. Like,
it has to go somewhere.
Like, can you, like, if it's not coming off there, it's staying on there. Like, believe me if you want, but like, I'm telling you, It's obvious my land. So they say for every percentage increase in organic matter, you heard 20,000. I'm sure you've heard this 1,000 times, but you heard like 20,000 more litres of, and it's just true. Like you within 3 years, and I've done nothing that no one else can do. All I've done is strip graze sheep. That's all I've done. Nothing, now we've got electric fencing. I've done nothing on my farm that no one else in the whole country can do. But the amount of water it's now holding, and it's obvious from the stuff, my roots are still getting that water that was rain, the total surface is dry, but they're getting, it's just,
and you're getting phone calls now of your neighbours. Like, are they? I mean, they look over the fence, over the hedgerows with on their big tractors. But are they starting to knock your door? Like, we thought you were crazy, but your grass looks amazing.
I have started seeing. There's a dairy farm opposite, and they've started strip grazing their dairy cows, and I've never seen that in like 40 years. So yeah, it's quite interesting, and I think
it's very interesting. There's a satellite picture of, I think it's Mark Shepherd's farm from above, obviously, and you can see which neighbors have started putting keyline design in. Like, it's amazing. You can see, his farm, and then you see the others, and you see where it stops, like exactly, and everything is straight again. And then you see these really nice curves. And so you can see the spread almost. And of course, if you talk to him, you would know exactly which ones are where and how, etc. But you can see this impact, probably on yours as well. You could see over the next years, you can see how this, like the greener grass and the better growth grass, because that's all you can measure from satellite pictures. That's not so
what would be more
difficult.
interesting is, so I used to play cricket. I don't know if where you are of cricket, but like I used to play for my
not a lot.
Yeah, I used to play for my local side 30 years ago, and for 25 years I was in London. I then came back and started playing for them 3 years ago, and they're all sheep farmers, and they like put up with me for 3 years. They see me on Instagram. They call me like the Instagram farmer, but I did an event on my wood. Like, an American company came over and did a banquet, and there were some cert tickets. So I invited some of the cricket guys along, and genuinely, like, they were blown away. Like, they just, I mean, this is the bit I get. I've had chefs. I can get anybody who doesn't know farming to come to my land, and if I want
to, excited.
I can get them thinking I'm a genius and the best farmer in the world, right? But it's not.
But your neighbour farmers and your cricket mates are different.
Yeah, they within a nanosecond. By the time they park their cars and walk towards me, they already knew if I was a bullshit or not. It's like, is he making money? Is that? And I had so much grass, and I was doing it so differently, and like the bits, and their grass had stopped growing by then, and because I'd it was just and one of them was so. And I didn't really think about it. The next day, I was also cutting hay, and the guy said, how much, he actually very kindly got his mate to bale it all up, and we got a really good yield on my hay. And he just said something so nice it's, basically like, mate, actually, you're a pretty good farmer. That was all it took. Honestly, I feel emotional. That's all it took was him, like an actual farmer, to go, actually, mate, like, you're pretty good. Like, it was like
the imposter syndrome was solved.
There. Yeah. Like, but to be honest, I know it sounds cocky, but I just know it's working. You know what I mean? It was lovely to hear from them, but I sort of, when I was doing the restaurants and chefs, I knew it was bullshit. I knew it was nonsense. Like, I knew how good I was. It wasn't very good. But this, I'm not saying I could be good on another farm, but on my family farm, I know I couldn't be trying harder to be better. If I went to another farm, who knows? I'd probably cock it up. But
we'll see that now with the railway line. So it's going to be how that's going to go. I want to thank you so much for your time, Matt, to come on. I mean, you have a lot to do. Like, you need to spend another 4 or 5 hours today looking at your land, which is very important. I'm not making a joke here. I'm not being cynical. It's fundamental, because that observation leads to, the results and the flavor we just heard about. But I want to thank you so much for coming on. I don't think it's going to be the last time. I really enjoyed it. It's probably the longest interview we ever did, but with really, really good reasons, and so many other rabbit holes to unpack. So I want to thank you for now. I will put all the links below of your social media for people to follow, to come and visit, to see what's possible, and to taste what's possible, and to understand, and to listen to farmers, because they are the only ones that really know the land. So thank you so much for your time, for all that you do, and for taking the time to come here and share your story.
Thank you. I've loved it. It's been brilliant, actually. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end. For the show notes and links discussed, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/post. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again, and see you next time.